Good evening to everyone joining us for this Franco-German Dutch webinar on the French presidency of the European Union. My name is Landry Charrier. I'm the attaché for scientific and academic cooperation at the French Embassy in the Netherlands, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this fantastic discussion. On the 1st of January, France took over the presidency of the Council of the European Union from Slovenia. Member states holding the presidency work together closely in groups of 3 called trios. The trio sets long-term goals and prepares a common agenda determining the topics and major issues that will be addressed by the Council over an 18-month period. On this basis, each of the 3 countries prepares its own more detailed 6-month program. Today, we will take a look at the priorities of the current trio that is made up of France, Czechia, and Sweden, and at the same time, dive into the ambitious program of the French presidency under the motto, Recovery, Power, Belonging. We will start with a keynote from Ambassador Vassy, whom I will introduce in just a few moments. Then we will have a panel with 3 amazing experts from France, the Netherlands, and Germany. And then we will get to the discussion with you, the audience. So let me start by introducing our keynote speaker, and that's Vassy. Mr. Vassy is serving as the French ambassador to the Netherlands since September 2019. He also represents France at the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in The Hague. His diplomatic career began in 2004, and he has held numerous portfolios for the French Foreign Ministry since then, from being responsible for the French-Indian relations to nuclear non-proliferation. He has also been posted in the French embassy in Washington and has worked for different French ministries as a cabinet director. Before giving him the floor, I would like to express my warmest thanks to our distinguished partners, namely the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for the Freedom, represented this evening by Madame Iris Müller, the Center for Advanced Security, Strategic and Integration Studies at the University of Bonn, represented by Maximilian Schranner, the Centre Ernst Robert Curtius at the University of Bonn, represented today by Dr. Christina Schröer. I would also like to extend my warmest thanks to our moderator, Andreas Noll from the Deutschlandfunk and the Deutsche Welle, and to our interpreters, Norbert Heilkamp and Peter Meuren. 1 or 2 notices about today's event. We will be using the chat function in Zoom. I'm sure everybody is extremely familiar with it by now, but just a reminder to use this button if you want to offer a view, pose a question, and a quick request from my side, please make your question as succinct as possible. That makes it much easier for our moderator, Andreas Noll, to bring it in our discussion. As you have probably noticed, we have a live interpretation. If you want to change the language, just use the button on the bottom of your screen and select the language you want to work with, either English or German. I leave it there. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for taking time from your very busy schedule to be the guest speaker at our event. That's a great honor for us to have you here this evening. And now, Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Landry, and thank you to everyone for participating into this event. And also naturally for taking interest, let's say, in the French presidency of the European Union. For this introduction that I will try to keep short, I don't really want to enter into a description of the three pillars of the French presidency, because they have been, I think, at this point very well explained and presented by my political authorities. But I'd like to have a kind of reflection on what they mean, and maybe finding the silver lining, or the fil rouge, as we say in French, that connects all these three pillars that are, as been just recalled, recovery, power, and belonging. Let me maybe look first at the word power. As I said, I think in another context, it so happens that that word, in fact, translates two French words. One is pouvoir, and the other is puissance. And these two have, in fact, pretty different connotations. One, I think, conveys the idea of coercion, pouvoir, and puissance is in a way more static and looks more into the qualities that make you able to exert or to act in a certain direction. And I think, in a sense, that the three components send us back to a major question that is extremely timely these days, in these days of crisis, of health crisis, but also I think it's also fair to say in these times of geopolitical crisis, which is the question of control. Not so much the issue of control as a way to exert control over people or group of people, but more the question of the control of our own destinies as Europeans and as European countries. If you look at the three pillars, I think it's fair to say that you will always find this question of our ability collectively to set a direction for us as a continent, as a group of countries, and to use the resources that will make us capable of reaching the goals we've set independently. And here I think it's fair to say that you see these two other very French concepts, even though they are now, I guess, fully accepted, or mostly accepted in the European context. One being the issue of European sovereignty, and the other one the issue of strategic autonomy. Of course, there are nuances between the two concepts, but at the same time, I think it's also fair to say that at least in a French mind, they overlap to a very large extent. And what do they mean in essence when we look at them? They mean that we have to ask ourselves collectively as Europeans if we are willing to remain in control of the major events that are playing out inside the continent or just at our borders, and being able to act to direct them or to bring them to the direction we have decided to set collectively. So most of the French presidency of the European Union will be looking at these issues. So the first one is the question of our ability to agree on the geopolitical context in which we are working or living. And I think that brings us to the major council that will happen in March, in which, as you know, we will be looking at the strategic compass of the European Union. And I think what the question that will be asked to us there is that of our ability collectively to develop a common understanding of our strategic environment, and also a common understanding of the resources or the capacities or the institutional frameworks that we want to be able to mobilize in order to tackle the challenges that are coming in our direction. So once we'll have set this common understanding, we'll have also to see what kind of resources will be necessary. I will set aside the obvious question of defense expenditure, even though I think the debate in that regard is going in the right direction at the European level. And I have to say that one of the major takes for me of the coalition agreement that we just had in December in the Netherlands is the very significant increase that has been announced in defense expenditure. And I think in that sense, the Netherlands is going in the right direction, as many other European countries have. Of course, when you look at resources, it also has to do with energy, for example, and I think there too, we've been seeing in the last few months, actually, that our dependencies towards the outside come with a price, not only the price of energy itself, which has increased a lot in the last few months, but also the sentiment that we are becoming more dependent from external actors. So there too, in connection with our goals in terms of decarbonization of our economies, we have a very deep soul searching to do in order to see what are the possibilities for us collectively to reduce our dependencies, not only from fossil fuels in general, but also from outside players. Being in control means also being able to mobilize economic resources in order, specifically in the areas that are technologically more advanced. And I think there too, the Europe collectively will have to decide how to develop strategies in order to remain at the cutting edge of these sectors. I was this morning in Eindhoven visiting NXP and ASML. Of course, we discussed a lot about the semiconductors sector, and Europe collectively, member states also will have to develop strategies in order to make sure that we remain relevant in these extremely important value chains that is at the core of the digital economy. More broadly, we'll have to be looking at the cloud, more generally at the digital economy. We'll have to also decide what kind of regulations we'll be setting in place for the major digital actors, because it's a question of being there too in control of the key resources that will make us competitive, and in essence also strong enough to sustain the efforts in defense or beyond that will allow us to remain relevant or to have leverage on other actors from the outside. And maybe that will be my final point, control is not only geopolitical, it's not only in the economic sector. I think we also have, and that brings me to the third pillar, the pillar that we've called belonging. I think we also have an issue that will be key in the French presidency of control of the narrative and the question of European identity and the way we define it. It's a very complex question in a sense, but a key one in which we see, and we had that very interesting discussion yesterday in a webinar that I can only advise you to look at with Luc van Middelaar and Caroline de Reiter and Pierre Vimont. The question of identity is, of course, very much intertwined with that of sovereignty, in a sense, because most political bodies, in order to become sovereign, have developed a kind of common understanding of what their identity is. This this sentiment of belonging allows them to create a political body that will exert sovereignty. On the other hand, the European project is very specific in that it is also the development of a common sovereignty. It's also the ability to overcome crises, including the current health crisis in which we are living, that creates also shared instruments, but also shared experiences that also will become at some point elements of a shared identity. But the question of identity will remain a sensitive one. It is true that European countries, when they look at themselves when they look one to the other, tend to see the differences between themselves. And as Caroline, the writer, wrote in her recent book, it's obviously not the same to be in Brussels or to be in Vienna. At the same time, if you have had the chance, like me, to live abroad or outside of the European continent, let's say, you can also see how much we have in common if you compare to other areas in the world. And so this question of identity is based on the idea that we are, of course, very different. And at the same time, I think we all accept deep down that words such as European identity or European culture or European history have a meaning. We sense what is beyond these words. And the French president, when he launched the French presidency of the European Union, insisted on the concepts of enlightenment, also l'humanisme, also human rights, of course, democracy, as key components of these common values that are the bricks, let's say, that create a European identity. But still, it's a debate that we need to have because we live in this strange situation in which we've lost, if I may say, also control of the debate on European identity. Why? Because we have some that want to pull us towards a definition of European identity that is extremely static, let's say, and looks at excluding entire swath of our populations. But we also see people that want to deny us the ability to define ourselves on the basis of values, or that would claim that defining European identity is in itself negative. There too, I think there would be value to that debate and to regaining control of it, because it will be very difficult to deepen a project that is really needed if we want to be able to act collectively, if we are not able to define what we are, in a sense, before or in conjunction with our willingness to be more active in the outside. Maybe a last sentence to say that all these debates, in a sense, that's what makes me extremely optimistic for the next few months, come from the inside, of course, from European citizens themselves. And in that regard, I think it's interesting to see that the conference on the future of Europe has been a real success in terms of participation. But also very important, it comes with from a pressure from the outside. The world is so aggressive. The players out there are so adamant in their willingness to weaken the European project that, in a sense, we are obliged, or we have to regain this control on our goals, control on our resources, and control on the narrative around our identity. Thank you very much.
Ja, vielen Dank, Botschafter Vassy. Ich lasse jetzt mal ein paar Sekunden noch die Dolmetscher durchatmen, damit sie den Vortrag zu Ende verdolmetschen können, und beginne dann langsam mit meiner Begrüßung. Also vielen Dank für die Einführung ins die pointierte Einführung ins Thema. Vielen Dank auch Landry, Charrier für die Begrüßung und damit auch von mir herzlich willkommen zu unserem heutigen Webinar zum Start Frankreichs in die EU-Ratspräsidentschaft am Tag 11 dieser Ratspräsidentschaft, die regulär am 1. Juli an Tschechien weitergereicht wird, aber vielleicht möglicherweise früher schon etwas an Schwung einbüßen könnte, was wiederum mit dem französischen Wahlkalender zu tun hat, über den wir heute auch sprechen müssen. Genauso wie über das vom Botschafter gerade ja detailliert erwähnte Konzept der europäischen Souveränität. Er hat auch viel von Kontrolle gesprochen und die Zukunft des Stabilitäts- und Wachstumspaktes, um nur mal 2 Schlaglichter für unsere heutige Diskussion zu nennen. Zeit bleibt uns leider nur bis 20 Uhr. Und bevor wir starten, möchte ich natürlich kurz noch unsere Panelisten vorstellen und Sie, liebe Zuschauer, noch einmal kurz auf die Dolmetschfunktion aufmerksam machen bzw. erinnern. Landry, Charrier hat es gerade ja schon mal erklärt. Da unten gibt es den Globus in der Statusleiste. Auf den müssen Sie klicken, um dann in Ihrer Muttersprache diese Veranstaltung zu verfolgen. Und damit zu unserem Panel. Aus Paris zugeschaltet ist Tara Varma, die dort den European Council on Foreign Relations leitet. Die Sicherheitsexpertin hat in London und Paris studiert und blickt auf berufliche Stationen unter anderem in Shanghai, Delhi und Paris zurück. Sie wird natürlich heute schwerpunktmäßig die französische Perspektive in die Debatte einbringen. Ebenfalls in Frankreich, aber in Grenoble, sitzt Johanna Möhring. Ihre wissenschaftliche Laufbahn hat sie an Universitäten in Deutschland und Frankreich, aber auch in die USA an die Johns Hopkins Universität geführt. Heute ist Johanna Möhring Research Fellow am Cassis der Universität Bonn und auch unter anderem Präsidentin der Vereinigung Women in International Security in Frankreich. Aus den Niederlanden nimmt Rem Korteweg an unserer Diskussion teil. Er hat in seiner wissenschaftlichen Laufbahn unter anderem in London gearbeitet und sich in seiner Arbeit mit dem Brexit beschäftigt, aber auch mit der strategischen Rolle Europas in der Welt. Auch das hat der Botschafter gerade ja angesprochen. Rem Korteweg ist heute Research Fellow am renommierten niederländischen Think Tank Klingendahl Institut in Den Haag. Ihnen allen ein herzliches Willkommen heute Abend. Starten möchte ich die Diskussion mit einem kurzen Blick auf die Tagespolitik, weil sich das nun wirklich anbietet, die schon zu diesem frühen Zeitpunkt der französischen Ratspräsidentschaft ja ein Schlaglicht werfen könnte. Die Rede ist von der Krise in der Ukraine, von einem Bedrohungsszenario durch Russland seit nunmehr vielen Wochen und Monaten an der ukrainisch-russischen Grenze. Gestern nun gab es in dieser Krise die von Russland lang ersehnten direkten Gespräche zwischen russischen und amerikanischen Unterhändlern in Genf, ohne Durchbruch, aber auch ohne Abbruch, muss man sagen. Tara Varma, Washington und Moskau entscheiden über Sicherheitsfragen auf dem europäischen Kontinent, sozusagen über die Köpfe der Europäer hinweg. Da ist dann nicht mehr viel von Kontrolle, hat man den Eindruck. Ist das eine Bürde für Präsident Macron, die Ratspräsidentschaft, oder kann er sich damit erst recht bestätigt fühlen, weil er ja immer wieder für mehr europäische Souveränität wirbt, um mal dieses berühmte Stichwort direkt in die Runde zu werfen?
I'm sorry, I have a little child crisis at home. Was this question addressed to me? Because there was a switch in the translation. It was addressed to me. Can I switch it on to Joanna? I'm sorry, I'm alone right now, so if Joanna could answer.
Absolutely, no problem. I will chime in. I'm delighted. Well, thank you very much, first of all, to the organizers for having us, for hosting this event. And thank you very much for the excellent introductory remarks by Mr. Ambassador. So you wanted to know how difficult it is to have an international crisis while you're trying to run the presidency of the European Union. I think it's quite difficult. I think the most difficult is this feeling that you are in a truly European moment and that you have no tools to really answer to the challenge. When I mean European moment, I think of a moment that is not marked by enthusiasm for the European Union, but rather by geopolitical, economic, and pandemic causes that show us that without the European Union, without standing together, we actually are nothing. But we find out that we don't really exist in this particular crisis because Russia has very carefully decided to throw down a gauntlet by presenting these two treaty draft texts in December and addressing only the United States and NATO. And perhaps it was a tactical mistake of the Biden administration to actually accept not to appear with a common front, but there we are. What we find out is that we have not really developed tools to answer to which looks like a 19th century power wielding in the 21st century, which is ironic because European countries, after all, have developed power politics, but we have also tamed our instincts and developed in the European Union a mechanism to diffuse power. And the French presidency is all about, as President Macron has already pointed out at the Munich Security Conference, I think it was 2020, for Europe to rediscover being a powerful actor. But the problem is that Europe was never an actor. It was always countries that acted wielding power. So we have to really learn rather quickly, because the environment doesn't give us much time. As the ambassador has already pointed out, the hostile environment forces us to quickly learn to deal with countries that are not behaving in a civilized way.
Frau Möhring, Sie haben ja auch immer den Blick auf die deutsche Politik. Die deutsche Bundesregierung hat direkt zum Start der französischen Ratspräsidentschaft getwittert und das natürlich auch politisch entsprechend verkauft, dass man diese Präsidentschaft, diese französische Präsidentschaft nach Kräften unterstützen wolle. Wie könnte das konkret in dieser Krise aussehen? Wenn wir mal kurz zurückblicken, es gab ja schon mal diese deutsch-französische Zusammenarbeit in der Ukraine-Krise mit dem Normandie-Format, das damals die vorherige Kanzlerin ja mit dem vorherigen Präsidenten installiert hat. Wie könnte es jetzt in dieser Krise, ja, wie könnte man an diese Krise anknüpfen oder an dieses Format anknüpfen? Welche Möglichkeiten bieten sich der deutschen Regierung, um hier den Franzosen zu helfen?
I would say, and I'm really sorry if I sound rather pessimist on this front, so to say, in the literal way, in the actual way. I think that Germany in this situation finds itself in a very difficult spot, because it's even less used to thinking in terms of power and acting in terms of power. And it has relied very consistently on the idea of diplomatic process and formats to really drive the relationship with Russia, and to sort of almost trying to mirror its own experience coming back into the fold of civilized nations by being integrated in norms of behavior. But how do you deal with a country that is not willing to play the game and that is not interested to advance through process and dialogue? So it strikes me as rather helpless to hear the constant refrain of wanting to revive these kind of diplomatic fora, and to really cling on to the idea that as long as you keep talking, things will somehow turn out right in the end. It's true. I mean, diplomacy also happens if there's a war going on, but dialogue cannot really happen if one side is not really able to talk.
Rem Korteweg, schauen wir mal nach Den Haag. Die Niederlande, die stehen als kleines EU-Mitgliedsland ja nicht so häufig im Zentrum der Debatten in der Europäischen Union, zumal in Sicherheitsfragen. Dabei sprechen wir hier über die 5. größte Volkswirtschaft der Europäischen Union. Auch sicherheitspolitisch sind die Niederlande ja extrem engagiert, wie wir nach dem Abschuss der MH17-Maschine über der Ukraine gesehen haben, wo aus Den Haag wirklich großer Druck in Richtung Moskau ausgeübt wurde, aufgebaut wurde. Kann man schon abschätzen, wie geopolitisch aktiv diese neue Regierung, die sich ja erst gestern gebildet hat, in den kommenden Monaten die französische Ratspräsidentschaft unterstützen könnte?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Andreas. And first of all, let me just say what a pleasure it is to be part of this Franco-German-Dutch event. And may there be many more like this, because I think, particularly from a Dutch vantage point, and as Ambassador Vassy mentioned, we just have a new government installed. From a Dutch perspective, the Franco-German relationship is going to be absolutely critical in terms of also shaping Dutch foreign and security policy in Europe. Now, on your question regarding the current crisis between Russia and the West, or the crisis on the Ukrainian border, I think it's first of all important to note that the timing of this crisis is not a coincidence. The crisis emerges at a moment when Europe, the European Union, is very preoccupied with itself. We've been waiting for the outcomes of the German elections with a new German coalition, of course, being installed. Only recently, it's just started. It doesn't have its feet under the table just yet. And you see a certain degree of how would you say it, sort of startup problems in terms of German foreign policy responding very clearly. France, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later, is of course also facing an election of its own in a couple of months' time. Now, we've already discussed the Netherlands. I don't think that Vladimir Putin is very much keen on keeping track of Dutch politics, but what it does show is that the EU as such is facing a period of change, political change. And in that context, it's very difficult for the EU, whether that's the big countries or the smaller countries like the Netherlands, to really move towards a common position in a geopolitical crisis like we have right now. And you see the United States basically showing a degree of impatience and happily sidestepping any discussion about restarting the Normandy format and simply engaging on bilateral talks with Putin, which suits Putin just fine. Now, to your question, what role the Netherlands will play? Again, the new Minister of Foreign Affairs, it's his second day in the office. But what I expect is that there will be a certain degree of continuity with the previous government, and that there will be very strong support for taking a rather tough line vis-a-vis Russia. At the same time, just echoing what Johanna has been saying, this necessity for Europe, the EU, to play a role. If anything, the Netherlands supports this notion that Europe cannot be the playground, but needs to be a player. Well, unfortunately, today it is very much still a playground. So how to resolve that? I fear that the current crisis comes too soon for the EU really to play a role. Tomorrow, the ministers of foreign affairs are meeting in Brest. 2 days afterwards, there's the Gymnich, the informal foreign ministers meeting. I'm sure they're going to talk a lot about the things we're talking about right now, but what can they do? What can they do? How can they restart the Normandy format? How can they ensure that the EU has a seat at the table? Rather than simply shouting by the sidelines that it's important that the EU has a voice of its own. Looking towards the middle and longer term, I think that this Dutch government is fully on board with a number of the priorities set out by the French presidency, the European Defense Summit that comes up, the whole notion of strategic autonomy. Dutch foreign policy is traditionally strongly pro-Atlantic, but we've seen a recent shift towards embracing much more European cooperation on security and defense affairs. This is also where the bulk of the momentum in Dutch defense policy is, and that is completely in line with the current French priorities. But, and then I'll shut up, the program of the French presidency is very ambitious, and rightly so. And we need that type of European leadership at the moment. But as the Germans can well attest to, events have a tendency of interfering with the best intended plans. And so the question in my mind is, just as COVID had a tendency to kind of undermine Germany's EU presidency ambitions, to what extent a geopolitical crisis like this could potentially put pressure on France's very ambitious agenda and its ability to deliver in the few months it has.
Tara, in der Hoffnung, dass sich die Lage in Paris ein wenig beruhigt hat, jetzt auch die Frage nochmal, welche Rem war gerade sehr vorsichtig, was die Einschätzungen anbelangt. Die Krise kommt zu früh für die Europäer, sagt er. Möglicherweise, auch das war gerade bei ihm zu hören, wird diese Ukraine, diese geopolitische Krise auch die französische Ratspräsidentschaft ja über einen längeren Zeitraum belasten. Wie sieht man das in Paris bei Präsident Macron? Sieht er das eher, diese Krise, als Chance oder tatsächlich auch als Belastung?
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks, Andreas, for the question, and apologies for my own little crisis at home. I hope there won't be any other interruptions. And thank you so much, Joanna, for taking over. I think President Macron knew what he did when he decided to pursue the current agenda of the French EU Council presidency. He could have decided to postpone it. The option exists in the treaties. He could have, decided actually to do it in the second semester of 2022. But I think very early on, he knew that there would be an advantage for him in being the main pro-European candidate on the French political landscape. That was already the case in 2017. In the second round of the presidential election, this is how he portrayed himself. And in a way, this has been his motto. We've talked about this a little bit, Ambassador Vassy and Joanna and Rem as well. Strategic autonomy, European sovereignty, they've really been the foundation of what he's fought until now. And the matter of the fact today is there are not that many openly pro-European candidates in the French political landscape. So I think he was very conscious of what he was doing. And I think to some extent he will weaponize the French EU presidency inside his own political campaign, because whether it be on the far left, on the far right, but even on the right, there's quite a bit of reluctance in presenting yourself as a pro-European. And I would say the mainstream left is now counting for very, very little share of the vote. So I think they're quite aligned with Macron, whether it be the Greens or the Socialist Party. But honestly, in terms of numbers today, they clearly don't represent a majority, and they actually represent a minority. So I think he's going to try and use it as much as possible. If you look at the photo, there are a lot of priorities. And as Rem said, it's a very ambitious agenda, particularly ambitious because, even though most French officials would contest that, the French EU presidency is going to be mainly happening between now, January and March, because then the campaign for the presidential election and the parliamentary election start. And that's going to take basically a big chunk of April and May. And then there are events that are going to resume in June. But if you look at the program, the calendar, the schedule of the events, honestly, the big chunk of it is between now and March. If you look at the foreign policy priorities, they're EU-AU, European Union, African Union Summit, the Indo-Pacific Ministerial Forum, and the European Defense Summit that Rem mentioned as well. So I think that represents also quite well what Macron has tried to do until now. Rebuild a relationship with the African continent, something that works both ways, that is the basis of an equal partnership. That was also the ambition of the European Commission, by the way. European Defense Summit. I'm sure we'll discuss this a bit further, but I think everyone knows in the audience that Macron has been pushing for European strategic autonomy quite a bit. Just want to add maybe a clarification or a point here on what Rem said earlier, saying that actually in the Netherlands, people are more transatlanticists and they've started looking more at being pro-European. I think what a number of French people have been trying to say for a while now is developing strategic autonomy, developing European sovereignty is not being anti-transatlanticist, quite the contrary. I think we know very well that there are a number of capacities, capabilities that are NATO's. There is no willingness to duplicate between NATO and the EU. The EU is not going to do now what NATO is doing, but there are a number of things that NATO is not doing. And I think the ambition from the French vantage point is that it would be good for the EU to be doing that. So what I mean is being pro-transatlanticist and pro-European are not mutually exclusive, quite the contrary. I think they're one and the same. And finally, if you look at the Indo-Pacific, the fact that the French are still pursuing this, despite the AUKUS crisis last fall, in a way that kind of launched the basis for a new Franco-American relationship, is also interesting, because it means that the French are still wanting for the EU to look at Africa, at much further away in Asia, but also at building its own capacities with the European Defense Summit. So I think these are all issues that Macron can also use a bit in the campaign. Traditionally, foreign policy features very marginally in French political campaigns, but what we saw with the AUKUS crisis, for instance, was a number of French leaders saying that maybe France, after AUKUS, needed to withdraw from NATO integrated command. I think the Ukraine-Russia situation is going to lead a number of political leaders to intervene on the Russia issue. So foreign policy, which is quite marginal usually in French political campaigns, I think will feature a bit more prominently. But this is also an area where Macron will be able to portray himself more as a statesman than any of the other candidates. He'll be able to say that he knows, and I think that's true, all the 26 leaders from the EU member states. He knows Joe Biden very well. He's been talking to Xi Jinping, to Vladimir Putin as well. So he's going to be able to show that he's the one who can represent France the best, both on the European stage and on the international stage.
Tara, jetzt ist das Wort, wie schon erwartet im Vorfeld, oder der Begriff der europäischen Souveränität in dieser Diskussion heute in den wenigen Minuten schon ganz häufig gefallen. Europäische Souveränität, das heißt ja, dass die Europäer selbst über ihr Schicksal entscheiden sollen. Das gilt aber nicht nur für die Sicherheitspolitik, über die wir gerade gesprochen haben. Es geht auch um Wirtschafts- und Digitalpolitik. Ich glaube, der Botschafter hat das auch genannt, und um andere Politikfelder. Was würden Sie sagen bei Macron? Auf welchem Gebiet sind Fortschritte für Frankreich jetzt in dieser Ratspräsidentschaft besonders wichtig? Gibt es da ein Feld, was man herausstellen muss?
You're absolutely right. And this is funny because in a way, for a long time on strategic autonomy, we were saying there was a difference of views between the French and other EU member states, where I think France from very early on considered that strategic autonomy, of course, was regarding defense, traditional security and defense issues, but it also encompassed actually a wide-ranging set of issues as economics, climates, tech. And I think there's been a lot of discussions, sometimes heated discussions inside the European circles. And I have the sense that this way of seeing things has permeated inside other European member states too. And if you look typically at the German coalition treaty, there's mention of European sovereignty when it comes to tech, when it comes to climate, when it comes to fighting economic coercion. I think strategic autonomy is also mentioned in the Dutch coalition treaty. So the French view, and we've been working at ECFR on this quite a lot, is to say, yes, security and defense are part of strategic autonomy, but actually climate, tech, health, all these issues are being weaponized by most of our geopolitical rivals, and there is a need for the EU to be able to react to that. I think the priorities that have been set out for the French right now are, of course, tech. with the DSA, the Services Act. And climate is quite important. And I mean, I think you'll discuss this a bit later, but there's the whole taxonomy debate between France and Germany as well. So tech and climate are the two issues that pertain to European sovereignty in this kind of larger view of it that the French will want to defend as much as possible.
Rem, schauen wir jetzt nochmal auf die Niederlande. Was ist für die Niederländer, für die neue Regierung der wichtigste Aspekt in der Debatte um die europäische Souveränität, so wie sie Frankreich versteht? Sind es sicherheitspolitische Fragen oder blickt die Politik vielleicht auf dieses Thema eher durch die ökonomische Brille? Die Niederlande sind ja eine alte Handelsnation. Wirtschaftliche Fragen spielen hier eine große Bedeutung.
Yeah, I think it's not a question of either or. It's I think the strategic autonomy rhetoric has been adopted in the Dutch context, a good French export indeed. And it relates both to the defense realm as well as the industrial policy realm, where I think the most interesting development is taking place is not so much in the defense space, because there traditionally Dutch defense policy has relied both on European cooperation as well as NATO. The interesting part, in my view, is really what's happening in the industrial policy, politique commerciale, and trade space. Because there you really see that a traditional laissez-faire neoliberal market embracer like the Netherlands has come to terms with the geopolitical and geoeconomic reality that the single market is under pressure, that it needs to be defended, that access to it needs to be defended. So you see the Netherlands pushing very strongly for investment screening, for level playing field instruments to ensure that third countries, say, let's call them China, doesn't undermine the level playing field inside the single market and make it unable for Dutch or other firms to compete on an equitable basis. And at the same time, that the single market is a very strong tool that the European Union can use to promote its own values, its norms, and its standards abroad. So what we've seen recently is very interesting Dutch-French cooperation in terms of moving the debate on sustainability and trade forward. The Netherlands and France worked together to move the discussion forward on regulating American big tech platforms. France and the Netherlands have joined forces on a quantum initiative. And paraphrasing it in a one-liner, it seems like Dutch industrial policy is becoming quite a little bit more French. And that is something new, because you could argue that even the Dutch, this last stalwart, if you will, of neoliberal open economy, let the market do its work, is accepting the notion of stronger European level intervention and instrumentalization of the single market.
Ist das eine Folge des Brexit? Ich meine, die Niederländer waren ja traditionell die besonders engen Verbündeten des Vereinigten Königreichs. Jetzt ist dieser Verbündete abhanden gekommen durch den Brexit. Jetzt musste man sich neu orientieren. Geht diese Orientierung jetzt tatsächlich Richtung Frankreich?
It's very tempting to find monocausal reasons for why things happen and to point to Brexit as the alpha and omega of why European policy is changing. I don't think it stands up to scrutiny. In fact, if anything, you see in the UK a similar debate taking place. The UK is also embracing a degree of state intervention that we didn't really associate with British economic thinking previously. Also, I think that the Dutch really, to use that term autonomously, drew the conclusion that it's important to protect the single market. And that is a consequence of Brexit, if you will. It's not the fact that the UK left, but that the Brexit negotiations showed how important it is for countries to stick together and to protect the single market. And one of the little known secrets of the Brexit negotiations is that aside from France pushing Michel Barnier to take a somewhat tough line on British conditions for getting market access to the European Union, it was also the Netherlands that insisted on very stringent guarantees about the level playing field, about state subsidies, about state aid rules, before giving the Brits access to the EU single market. And so that is where Brexit comes in, not because all of a sudden we've lost our like-minded partner on the other side of the North Sea.
Johanna, wir müssen natürlich auch über die neue Bundesregierung in Berlin sprechen, in dieser Diskussion, in diesem Webinar. Berlin und Paris, die betonen aktuell bei fast allen Gelegenheiten ihre Gemeinsamkeiten. Aber es gibt ja schon ganz zu Beginn dieser EU-Ratspräsidentschaft der Franzosen durchaus auch Konflikte, die für alle deutlich werden. Beim Thema Energie zum Beispiel. Tara hat das gerade genannt, das Thema Taxonomie. Die französische Regierung hat durch eine kluge Diplomatie, man konnte das am Wochenende in den deutschen Zeitungen zumindest nachlesen, in der EU durchsetzen können, dass die Atomkraft von Brüssel für nachhaltig, für grün erklärt wurde. Das ist für die Grünen in der deutschen Regierung natürlich nur sehr schwer zu verdauen. Ist damit das kritischste Thema zwischen Berlin und Paris schon am Beginn dieser Präsidentschaft abgeräumt oder müssen wir uns auf mehr Streit in den kommenden Wochen gefasst machen?
Well, I think we definitely should not prepare for any fighting, because I think that the new government in Germany would do its utmost to be as constructive as possible. So maybe let me just a step back and talk about the nature of Franco-German relations in general. It is kind of a paradox that it's probably the most institutionalized relationship that exists in terms of bilateral relations within the European Union, but between countries that are very different and on many issues rather far apart. So whenever something happens, it's normally the fruit of a very strong effort that both parties, both sides have to make. And well, as Rem already pointed out, Germany has a new government and they are also in the business of finding basically their routines and how they get along. So they have no time to road test their coalition. It's no grace period, geopolitical crisis, and a very, very strong expectation from the French partner to be supportive. And the first visits obviously go traditionally to Paris, but we just have to kind of cite Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, that really came out. We want to support the French EU presidency. So I think what concerns this kind of rather time-critical 3 months that Tara has alluded to, because it's, after all, wrapped up in high electoral states, we can expect all difficult topics to kind of disappear under the carpet. But the conflict, or kind of material for conflict, exists. And I think you'll probably see as much crisis management on that front. I mean, you mentioned the taxonomy of energy sources, and we seem to have come to some sort of, well, at least officially on the government level, fudge position in terms of a classical European trade-off. Basically, you get nuclear power as green energy, and we will get the gas power plants in exchange, and we will not talk about it, we'll just abstain. So, I mean, that's not very pretty, but that just might how this particular issue play out. But we never know, because we have, of course, a groundswell of protest from the green basis. We have Austria that has threatened legal action against these decisions. And I mean, let's face it, obviously, it's not very how would I say, it doesn't look very good. But Germany is in the very, very difficult position. I mean, the central topic of the coalition treaty is the transformation of Germany into a climate neutral industrial nation. And the kind of red thread that goes through this document is that economic development and being green is not a contradiction. So there's humongous pressure on the government to deliver. And the issue of dependency on energy sources, and in the German case, having left precipitously the nuclear energy behind and now trying to phase out coal, leaves Germany with only gas to turn to. And that has also the added problem that it also kind of connects us to the geopolitical hotspot of the day, and that is, of course, Ukraine and Russia. So yes, I would say that there are lots of difficult issues, but we will not hear them, or we not see a lot of them for the coming months, because Germany will try to be as productive as possible to help France.
Rem, Johanna hat vom Gas gesprochen, da müssen wir dann auch mal wieder über die Niederlande sprechen. Die Niederländer gehören ja nicht zu den Nationen, die laut gegen die Taxonomie mit der nachhaltigen Atomkraft protestiert haben. Wir haben gerade gehört, eine mögliche Klage der Österreicher, aber die Niederländer sind nicht besonders kritisch in dieser Frage. Im Gegenteil, die gehören eigentlich zum Lager der Atomkraftbefürworter. Hinzu kommt, dass man in Den Haag gerade nicht besonders gut auf Deutschland zu sprechen ist, weil die Niederlande mehr Gas nach Deutschland liefern müssen, als eigentlich geplant war. Man also das eigene Gasfeld erst später schließen kann. Das sorgt für Proteste in der Bevölkerung. Wird gerade erst heute wieder berichtet, wie verstimmt die Niederländer sind, weil eben die Erdgasförderung dort für regelmäßige Erdbeben sorgen. Wo stehen die Niederländer in dieser Energiedebatte aus Ihrer Sicht?
That's a terrific question, which in a way is going to be one of the key dilemmas that the new Dutch government will have to solve or find a solution to. I mean, the quick answer to your question is this government is slowly moving towards nuclear. The coalition agreement projects the possibility of building 2 new nuclear power stations in the Netherlands. And in that sense, a taboo has been broken, because previously the Netherlands basically said that it was going to phase out its nuclear power, small scale though it may be, and sort of following a German line. This government now says that in order to meet its CO2 emission targets, it might actually make sense to start building new nuclear power plants again. So in that respect, again, what I said previously, there is a French echo in some of the things we read in the coalition agreement. Now, that's the coalition. There is a very strong opposition in Parliament to the taxonomy and to the notion that gas and nuclear are considered sustainable energy. But democracy is what it is, and so this coalition government is not going to, I think, put up a very strong fight in an EU context over the taxonomy.
Tara, ich würde gerne in dieser Diskussion noch mal etwas grundsätzlicher über so eine Ratspräsidentschaft sprechen. Die Taxonomiestrategie von Frankreich, die war von langer Hand geplant, vorbereitet, klug umgesetzt, muss man sagen. Die Ukraine-Krise oder jetzt auch Kasachstan, das sind Konflikte, auf die eine Ratspräsidentschaft dann sehr kurzfristig reagieren muss. Was würden Sie sagen, wie viel Gestaltungsspielraum gibt es eigentlich in so einer EU-Ratspräsidentschaft für die jeweiligen Staaten? Macht es tatsächlich einen großen Unterschied, ob Paris die Geschicke leitet und sehr ambitioniert ist, wie wir schon mehrfach an diesem Abend gehört haben, oder wie in 6 Monaten Prag?
I think what makes a difference is that the current EU presidency is showing a very strong alliance with the Commission. And so I think the discussion that have been going on between Macron and von der Leyen are that actually the EU needs to be at the table of negotiations, especially when this is about a topic that concerns European security directly. What we've been seeing until now, and this is what you were saying in your introduction, what Rem and Joanna were alluding to as well, is that unfortunately the EU is completely on the sidelines of these discussions. And it is mostly, I would say, Moscow's doing, because this is the kind of dialogue that they wanted to implement. They want to be back in a bilateral discussion with the United States. But at the same time, the EU finds itself a bit a victim of its, in French we say, impuissance. I don't know how we would translate that perfectly in English, but basically it's lack of actual power. One of the reasons why power is so central to this triptych of the French EU priorities is this. It's that we all agree that the EU is not powerful enough today to be able to solve this. I don't know the extent to which the EU would be the first respondent here, but it needs to be at least part of the discussion, and it is not as of yet. And I think this is a bit scary for us, because the future of our security is being decided without us, basically. I think what is helpful now is that there is a lot more dialogue between the Biden administration and EU member states. So there's more communication, more negotiation, more consultation. I think there's been quite a big leap forward, which is rather positive. But EU foreign policy is in the making. It's not yet a full-fledged instrument that the Europeans can use, and I think we're seeing this now. I think this is typically where we are struggling a bit, and I think we can be a bit worried for our future.
Johanna, Tara hat gerade vor einigen Minuten dieses innenpolitische Problem mal umrissen in Frankreich, das ja am 10. April und dann 2 Wochen später die zweite Runde also am 10. April die erste Runde der Präsidentschaftswahlen stattfindet, dann 2 Wochen später die Stichwahl und dann im Juni auch noch eine Parlamentswahl. Dass also diese EU-Ratspräsidentschaft auch innenpolitisch instrumentalisiert werden kann, wie die Opposition dem Präsidenten Macron ja auch vorwirft. Wir haben jetzt in dieser Woche gleich auch wieder schöne Bilder, die aus Frankreich gesendet werden. Die Außenminister und die Verteidigungsminister der Europäischen Union, die treffen sich in Brest. Das alles lässt sich super vermarkten für den Präsidenten. Ist das eigentlich für die Partner, sagen wir mal für Deutschland, ein Problem, dass man ja vielleicht den Eindruck haben kann, man ist dann eigentlich nur Teil einer großen Show geworden, oder spielt das keine besonders große Rolle?
I think that's an excellent question, that we all are basically asked to play a specific role to heed the political calendar. But let me just track back also to the question you asked to Tara, because what we see in the European context is quite interesting, because normally we have domestic politics and international affairs intruding. And Pierre Asner, who's a French philosopher and geopolitical expert, he referred to that as a clash of temporalities. So we are never aligned because we move at different speeds, and we will always be held hostage by unforeseen events. And the case of the European presidency adds another layer of complexity to it. It's basically a triple clash of temporality, because at the European level, even if you take over the council presidency, you're actually not directing the European Union. You are, for 6 months, trying to steer part of the lawmaking process, but not even putting in that many initiatives, because you have to deal with things that have been put in the legislative pipeline by presidencies that were happening 18 to 24 months before you arrive on the scene, because that's how European legislation works. It has to go through consultation. The European Parliament needs to co-decide. So it is quite difficult to ask yourself, how big is actually your freedom of maneuver and your freedom to really make a mark? And hence, of course, this emphasis on the first 3 months and the ability to call meetings, high-level meetings and summits, rather than actually focusing on the true council work, which might be rather less glamorous. So, but I think that even those initiatives that are symbolic and that are highly visual can be really useful for other European countries. And I think Tara and Rem might agree with me that especially the issue of migration in the sense of, I mean, we can wrap it under the pillar of belonging maybe, or protection also, the idea that the European Union appears as an actor that can protect its citizens, and that the outside, the kind of external borders are secure. So I think this summit that will happen in February with Africa is the beginning of a new approach, I think, that is now more and more accepted also by other European countries, to start to really put an emphasis on working together with countries that are either transit countries for migration or actually origin countries of migration, and to really shift the European approach on migration. And I think this would be useful not only for France in terms of electoral laurel, so to say. If you can bring that home, that would be a huge scoop. But it's also very important for other European countries, such as Germany and the Netherlands. And it's very significant that in the coalition treaty, you have the wish and the will, and that's quite interesting because you have the Social Democrats, the Liberal parties, and the Greens that agree that the current approach to migration is not working and that something needs to be done on that field.
Johanna, ich bleibe da ein bisschen an dem Thema dran, was ich am Anfang der Frage gestellt habe, nämlich beim Thema Statisten. Also müssen sich die Partner nicht auch so ein bisschen als Statisten vorkommen, die den Wahlkampf eines Präsidenten unterstützen in Frankreich, der wiedergewählt werden will. Wir haben das jetzt mehrfach gehört, in den ersten 3 Monaten ballen sich die Gipfel, ballen sich die Treffen in Frankreich, diese Woche in Brest. Es gibt noch Dutzende weitere in den kommenden Wochen. Ist das ein Problem oder kann man darüber einfach hinwegsehen als Partner?
Well, yes, it's definitely some diplomatic fireworks, but I think in the European Union, you don't only meet once, you meet all the time. So I think it is, even if it might grate a bit, that you're basically become this very international European prop. Well, a couple of months or years, you might be in the exact same situation and then rely on France to also be playing a productive role. So I think that's probably part of the nature of the game within the European Union, that if there is an alignment of, let's say, policy and vision, and I think Germany is now very well familiar with a very proactive President Macron since he appeared on the political scene. And there is a willingness and a wish to help foster his agenda, because there seems to be the realization that the Franco-German relationship remains very important, even if it's not the only game in town, and that it's almost your duty, so to say, as a good European, to do your best to avoid any kind of turbulence. But it's, of course, problematic because you are making a choice also for domestic politics, for domestic French politics. You throw your weight into the ring and to support one specific candidate. So yes, I think it is a bit problematic, but I think most politicians have accepted this to be the state of affairs.
Rem, wir haben gerade schon mal über den Brexit gesprochen. Die Verbindung zu Großbritannien, der Niederländer, die war ja auch deshalb besonders intensiv, weil man eben in Wirtschaftsfragen, in Finanzfragen sehr ähnlich tickte, will ich das mal nennen. Nun gibt es aus Paris auch für diese Ratspräsidentschaft mehrere Signale, die in Richtung Aufweichung der Stabilitätskriterien für die gemeinsame Währung zielen. Das müsste nach traditioneller niederländischer Lesart zu einem erbitterten Widerstand der Niederländer führen, die sich in den vergangenen Jahren ja zusammen mit Deutschland, aber auch, nachdem das in Deutschland etwas in den Hintergrund gerückt ist, ja, als Stabilitätsanker für den Euro gesehen haben. Von der neuen Regierung, gestern gerade erst ins Amt eingeführt, gerade von der neuen Finanzministerin, gibt es nun andere Signale. Wohin steuert das Land in dieser Frage? Werden die Niederländer zu einem neuen Partner für Macron auch in dieser Frage?
Let me take this question together with the point you discussed previously with Johanna, because I think in a way they are related. First of all, on your comparison between the Netherlands and the UK was never in the Eurozone. The UK was not a founding member state. The UK was not in Schengen. The parallel between the Netherlands and the UK only goes so far. Even if the Netherlands presented itself as one of the tough negotiators over the Corona Recovery Fund. I mean, if you ask serious Dutch analysts, it was always clear that in the end, Mark Rutte would strike a deal. It was never a possibility that Mark Rutte would do something like David Cameron did when he when he stepped out of the fiscal compact negotiations. So that just first of all. Your point, however, is of course relevant with respect to this frugal four composition and what the new Dutch government is going to look like. I mean, I've been commenting quite a bit on this recently. The fact that we have a new Dutch finance minister who is the leader of the most pro-European party in the Dutch coalition is very meaningful. If you look at the Dutch coalition agreement, it's much more constructive in its language towards reforming the Eurozone. It hints at taking a constructive approach towards modernization of the Stability and Growth Pact. It says that the Dutch Treasury itself is going to go beyond the 60% norm of fiscal criteria of your percentage of government debt to GDP. That suggests that the Netherlands is going to take a much more flexible approach. That could be music to Macron's ears. At the same time, this is the exact same language we see in the German coalition agreement. The German coalition agreement also says that any reform of the Stability and Growth Pact should be connected with sustainable debt levels. You see the exact same language in the Dutch coalition agreement. If anything, new Dutch EMU policy is going to mirror German EMU policy. So the question is basically also to what extent Lindner at the Finanzamt is going to be much more flexible, and that could also bring the Dutch along. But here's the connection with your question regarding whether the EU is a prop in Macron's re-election campaign. In my mind, this is still a very controversial question, also in the Netherlands, also because Dutch Parliament would have to sign off on this. Dutch Parliament doesn't take the same line that necessarily the Dutch finance minister does. In my mind, the question Macron has to answer for himself is, what does he want the EU to deliver him to make his re-election campaign possible? And is he going to ask for everything? In other words, is he going to ask for European support on a European defense union, on CBAM, on European sovereignty in the economic space, as well as fiscal reforms on Eurozone governance? If he wants everything in the short period of time, I think he's going to be disappointed, because he's going to force countries, when it comes to issues that are sensitive to their countries as well, to reconsider. I think that the Dutch are very willing to go a long way in terms of making it possible for Macron to show a certain degree of leadership and to show that he can play that role at the EU level. But a sensitive question regardless of who runs the Ministry of Finance, of really reforming Eurozone financial rules in a 3-month period when this Dutch government only took office yesterday. That's a pretty tall order. So I would say, yes, the Netherlands are going to be flexible, but give it more time. That's not, in my view, going to be settled by April 10th.
Tara, ich glaube, die Frage ging jetzt direkt von Den Haag nach Paris. Will Macron alles in diesen 3 Monaten, so wie Rem gefragt hat?
Thanks. I wanted to react to that. I don't think at all that he wants to accomplish all of this in 3 months. I think in a way, the Macron method is really about putting all these ideas on the table and making sure that they're at the center of the debate. And the, matter of fact today is you can agree or disagree. And a lot of Europeans have disagreed. We won't comment the, what was that? La mort cérébrale, NATO brain death at some point. I mean, on Brexit, he was supposed to be tough. On enlargement to the Balkans, he was supposed to be tough. In the end, I think what's important to him is he's the one putting these ideas on the table. There's discussion on it. He published an op-ed with Mario Draghi earlier in December on the fiscal reform. I think for Macron, the objective is to get back the idea of an ever closer union back on track. And clearly with Brexit, this concept, this political objective that the EU had has really, taken a hit. It was almost a taboo. A big part of the Brexit campaign was to say, actually, we don't want an ever closer union. What does it mean politically to have an ever closer union? What are we looking at politically, geopolitically? Do we want to give all these powers to the EU? This is not what the EU was set up for. So we have actually almost philosophical debates on what the EU is supposed to be. When we had the discussion on the recovery funds, that was a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now, and the Netherlands were in the frugal camp. It was a make or break moment, and I think Germany played a really important role there, because Merkel, she tipped the balance from one side to another, and I think it did change the future of the EU in a way. But I think for Macron, it's really about getting this idea of an ever closer union back on track and thinking about how we build together a closer European Union. And the debate is really going to be about this issue. And I have to say a number of member states have evolved also on that. If Macron is not the president in 4 months, then of course that changes quite a bit for the EU and for France. But I think if he is re-elected, this is the path that he will follow. And so the idea is not to do everything now, to answer your question, is not to do everything until April 10th, but it is to put out his European manifesto for 2022. What is the follow-up from the Sorbonne speech in 2017? And I think this is what we're looking at. Closer integration.
Okay, konkrete Nachfrage. Wie wichtig, weil wir gerade darüber gesprochen haben, wie wichtig ist ihm die Reform des Stabilitätspaktes? Wie wichtig ist diese Reform?
I am not an economic expert at all, so I would rather not answer your question. I don't know. I think it is quite important, but you would need someone else to answer this question properly.
Dann geben wir die Frage mal an Johanna weiter. Und mit der Bitte um eine Antwort aus kombinierter deutsch-französischer Sicht.
Ich werde mir Mühe geben. I'll try my best. So I think to start with the issue of timeline, it's absolutely impossible to squeeze this monster of reform of Stability and Growth Pact into the next 3 months. And it's on pause anyway until March 2022, and I think the European Union will just press another pause button, at least for a couple of months, because we're still in an absolutely uncharted situation. It's pandemic financing. I mean, it's very sad for the poor Greeks that had to suffer austerity policies after the kind of subprime turned into a financial crisis, then an economic crisis, and they had to kind of just bear the brunt of policies that were then instituted. But as we are now, everybody's in the same situation. I just, before this webinar, I had a look at the debt to GDP ratios right now. I mean, the Eurostat was ecstatic to announce that we are only at 98.3% European average. Hoo-hoo! I mean, small reminder, I mean, the Stability and Growth Pact normally foresees 60% and a 3% deficit. We have to bow down to REM because the Netherlands is about the only big economy of the European Union that is currently meeting those targets. And as a frugal country, it can now borrow, which it will do, to invest without even getting in danger of breaking that magical barrier of 60% debt to GDP. I mean, France is 116 and Germany is 70%. So we're not looking good. And at these levels, it's impossible to kind of use any tools in the toolbox of the Stability and Growth Pact. And I mean, may I remind us that it's now a 100-page document that is completely unreadable. So nobody knows what to do. I think so there'll be a combined way of dealing with it, kicking the can down the road, and then trying to basically find new criteria. What would be sustainable debt levels? And I think talk has been to somehow link debt levels to productivity of your economy. And let's not forget it. And we're preparing now for a major transition of the European Union in terms of wanting to cut our emissions by 55% by 2030 and become carbon neutral in 2050. I mean, the number of billions that will have to be spent is just eye-watering. So I think these things will be tied together at some creative fashion. And the question now that come back to Tara's point, was it a revolutionary moment for Germany to sign off on the recovery financing? And there, the jury is still out, I think. I mean, you can say that this was the end of Germany refusing Schuldenunion, so a debt union. But you could also say that it was just a crisis measure, basically commercial policy. I mean, some people say it was because the danger of German automotive industry was so big because the Italian economy in northern Italy was so closely tied to that you had to do something. So was it just a one-off thing? Because the idea is not only to borrow, to invest. I think what France's idea is more to have a real communitization of debt. So I think there is, so to say, material for conflict, because I would rather suspect that Germany, and especially the FDP in the Liberals in the finance ministry, will do their best not to go down that road.
Weil wir schon auf die 20 Uhr zurücken, möchte ich gerne noch eine Frage aus dem Q&A, also aus dem Chat von unseren Zuschauern mit einbinden. Eine provokante oder provokative Frage, wie es hier heißt. Und zwar, ist die Europäische Union einfach zu groß? Gibt es zu viele europäische EU-Staaten, um eine wirklich europäische Diplomatie, eine einheitliche europäische Diplomatie aufzubauen? Die Frage stelle ich in die Runde. Wer als erster antworten möchte, der tut das. Vielleicht
I'll have a crack at it first. We just lost a pretty not so insignificant state in the UK, which has, if anything, a formidable foreign security and intelligence capacity. Has Brexit led EU foreign policy to become better? I'm not so sure. In some areas, Brexit did unlock a number of topics, particularly regarding the development of European defense capabilities. And in that respect, you could say that Brexit actually did contribute to to a more coherent European foreign and security policy. On the other hand, given the role that the UK still continues to play in the European security realm, it's now a very important question how the EU and the UK cooperate on things of foreign policy, like sanctions policy, like how we deal with Russia, how we deal with China. That's not just an EU problem, it's also something that affects the UK. So on the face of it, it may be that a smaller group of countries could act quicker, but the continent is what it is. You need to be able to act in unison. And the best way you do that is through diplomatic cooperation and institutional cooperation. And so to that extent, I'm very, very sad that the UK opted not to develop structured foreign policy cooperation with the EU.
Rem, zum Ende unserer Debatte möchte ich nochmal ein Thema aufrufen, was ja in Deutschland auf der Straße gerade heiß diskutiert wird, von dem ich aber nicht weiß, ob es für die EU-Ratspräsidentschaft der Franzosen eine größere Rolle spielen wird in den kommenden Wochen und Monaten. Aber ich weiß, dass die Franzosen oder zumindest Präsident Macron hier seine eigenen Erfahrungen gesammelt hat, nämlich mit der Explosion der Energiepreise. Wir erinnern uns alle noch an die Gelbwestenbewegung. Die Explosion der Energiepreise ist gerade in Deutschland ein ganz großes Thema. Wer aktuell einen Stromvertrag hierzulande abschließen will, der zahlt gut 40, 45, vielleicht sogar 50 Cent pro Kilowattstunde. In Frankreich sind das, ich habe da heute noch mal einen flüchtigen Blick auf die Preislisten von EDF geworfen, da sind es gerade mal 16, 17 Cent, wenn das richtig ist. Ist das ein Thema, Rem, wo aus Ihrer Sicht Europa gefordert ist, vielleicht sogar die französische Ratspräsidentschaft gefordert ist? Könnte das noch Relevanz bekommen in den kommenden Wochen?
Well, absolutely. And I think, I believe it was Johanna that already hinted at the importance of energy as a topic under the French presidency. I mean, our countries are effectively facing the same situation, the energy spikes. People in the Netherlands connect this very clearly also to the shutdown of the Groningen gas field, which you've also touched upon. Nord Stream 2 factors in, at least the notion of importing more gas from Russia, which connects us back to the topic we started off at the beginning of our session. I mean, luckily, from a Dutch point of view, we have sufficient LNG import capacity that a number of the LNG that's being rerouted from Asia to Europe actually can access the Dutch and the broader European market. So it will go up and down, but the question of creating a reliable, affordable, and sustainable energy architecture in Europe is being forced upon us with very strong urgency. And this used to be a theoretical discussion among energy experts. Now people feel it in their wallet. And that can be a very important political driving force. So I would not be surprised if this is a theme that comes to define the governments of not just France and the Netherlands, but Germany and others as well.
Ja, ein gutes Schlusswort, wie ich finde. Und mit dem Blick auf die Uhr, wir haben die 8 Uhr schon überschritten, möchte ich die Debatte über den Start der EU-Ratspräsidentschaft auch an dieser Stelle jetzt zu einem Abschluss bringen und sage Danke zunächst an die Panelisten. Tara Warmer, ich kann das wirklich aus eigener Erfahrung gut nachvollziehen, wie schwer das ist, unter solchen Bedingungen mit kleinen Kindern in der Wohnung, im Haus, sich zu konzentrieren, so eine Debatte durchzustehen. Ganz, ganz großes Danke dafür, dass Sie das für uns gemacht haben. Danke natürlich auch an Johanna Möhring in Grenoble vom Cassis der Universität Bonn und vielen Dank auch Rem Korteweg vom Klingendahl-Institut in Den Haag für eine wirklich super spannende und facettenreiche Diskussion an diesem heutigen Abend, ganz zu Beginn der französischen Ratspräsidentschaft. Der Dank geht natürlich auch an unsere Partner, die diese Veranstaltung erst möglich gemacht haben. Das sind von der Universität Bonn, das CASSIS, das Centre for Advanced Security Strategic and Integration Studies, CASSIS, das Centre Ernst Robert Curtius, auch von der Universität Bonn, die Friedrich Naumann Stiftung für die Freiheit mit dem Regionalbüro Nordrhein-Westfalen und das Institut français der Niederlande. Last but not least, in dieser Diskussion in 3 Sprachen ganz dickes Dankeschön auch an unsere Dolmetscher, die das erst möglich gemacht haben, dass wir diese europäische Debatte länderübergreifend an diesem Abend führen konnten. Danke für Ihr Interesse im Chat auch und dass Sie so lange ausgehalten haben. Einen schönen Abend wünsche ich und sage bis bald.